Hello everyone and welcome to Kembali 2020, a Rebuild Bali Festival, a digital program designed to inspire, excite, reconnect and revitalize the Balinese and Indonesian community from the 29th of October until the 8th of November of 2020. Kembali, the Indonesian word for return or come back, represents revitalization in the face of global challenges. The festival will unite people in Bali and Indonesia together with an international audience at a time when travel is largely impossible and creating connections is more important than ever before. Please welcome our guest for today. I'm very excited to be hosting a conversation with Andrea Cote. I'm going to just get straight into it and just ask, how are you doing? How are you feeling, Andrea?
Thank you, Manal. I'm very excited to be here with you, even if it's in this long distance feature. This is very important to me, the connection we are creating at this moment. I am very excited to get to know all the different writers that the Kembali is bringing this year. And I'm very honored to be representing my country in this year version. And you know, I'm right now in El Paso, Texas. You guys are over there, and it is incredible that we are having this conversation, even though it seems we are in a more extreme lockdown every day. The computer is giving us the opportunity of being with our tribe, our poets around the world. So I'm very grateful for that.
Absolutely. And speaking of that connection, I love that we've been brought together through this as somebody who is a much less experienced poet, and someone like yourself who's been writing poetry for so long and doing different types of writing. I hope you don't mind that a lot of my questions are going to come from a place of, looking up to you. So I will be asking a lot of things about your experience. And the first thing I want to know about is, when did you start writing, and what was that journey like from when you first began writing until you published your first book, which was 17 years ago now?
Yeah, it's incredible that it's all that time. Well, I was born and raised in a particular town of Colombia that it has a very singular name. The name of my city is Barranca Bermeja. It means red cliff. It's a very warm city, and it's a city that was very affected by the internal violence in my country at the end of the 90s. I don't come from a family of artists or wasn't like directly nurtured into the art of writing poetry, but it just came natural to me, the idea that writing will be a way to understand myself better and to understand my surrounding better. I always think that what is more important about writing is not what you do with what you write, is what you write, is what you write do to yourself. And I experienced that like when I was a teenager. And so my first poems comes from a very young age when I was kind of recording the everyday experience of living in this particular environment and growing up in a very conservative family, and trying to find my place and my voice as a woman and as a witness of the end of a particular century. It was the 20th century, and also attending the birth of a new form of life and all that. So I started writing that way. And as many people who is not from the capital cities, I'm from the region, which in my country is very determinant because most of our mainstream literature comes from the inner cities, the capital cities and other cities of that type. It was in there was not a direct path or line to publishing my first book. So I was like, the way in which I was able to do it was because I participated in a national contest for young writers, and then a selection of the poetry I was writing was picked up, and that was the way in which I was able to do it. And since then, well, since change, I moved from that city. Now I emigrated to another country. I've been living in the United States for like more than 10 years already. So it's been a long journey, but it's always a journey of discovery and understanding. Then you have to move, and every movement you do poses a questions about your identity and about the way in which your writing responds to that.
Yeah. And what do you think, how do you think your writing has evolved based on your identity, based on the different places and the different times that you've lived through?
Well, like I haven't been like, I believe I haven't been a very prolific writing, in the sense that it takes me like 5 or 6 years to publish each poetry book. You know, I write a lot. Like, I also write critics. Like, you know, I'm a literary critic. I write essay. I'm all the time doing something. Like, but what I mean is, like, it takes me forever to come with the idea of a poetry book, and especially it takes me forever to put it out there and to say, okay, I'm ready to publish this. And the reason is because every particular book, I conceive every book as I'm not so interested in a book as a product. I'm more interested in books as a process. And I think every book represents a moment of my life in which I am going through the questioning of some particular ideas or problems or quests, some different quests, and that's a way in which I can define why my 3 books are somehow so different, my 3 poetry books. So my first book, is very attached, is a conversational book in which I propose very autobiographical description of the landscape of my country in relationship to the coming of age of 2 young sisters. So the book is a conversation with my sister that mainly asks about Colombian violence, but it's asking about it in a way in which I'm not directly denouncing or describing the violence. I'm trying to portray the feeling that violence created in my childhood, in the house I grew up in, etc. So violence in my country was one, and the difficulties of working and being a woman writer and all that are part of the reasons why I decided to emigrate to another country. So after I left Colombia, I started, reading different things, getting in touch with other traditions, getting to express myself and read and write in another language. And it of course created a very important change in my poetics. So when I was living in New York, that was the first place that I immigrated to. It was incredible for me to get to see the speed of the city, the idea of the city as a place that multiplies your vision. I was reading a lot of Baudelaire and Garcia Lorca and poets that previously were like tremendously transformed by moving into a big city and trying to get in touch with this energy reservoir that is to be there as a flaneur. So then I start writing about New York City, but not directly from the city. I was interested in the in the Chinatown neighborhood as a topic that fascinates me, and the idea that we live in a world in which everything is kind of fake and plastic and mass produced, and we as writers have to experience the language that way somehow. So in that time, my writing changed a lot, and I published 2 books. Actually, I just before I said just one book, because it's just one book in the sense, in the classical sense of the book. I took a book that was about the idea of loss and being in another country and ruins. But I did also make this project that is. I'm just gonna grab it from my.
Yeah, please.
This is it's an object book that I did during the years that I was living in New York, and I was trying to give it a form to my fascination with Chinatown. So I did my noodle poems that haven't touched this in a while, but I just wanted to show it to you. You know, it was another experience. I thought that you have to that I had to find a way to channel these questions about the city and about the newsfeed that wasn't the traditional book platform. So this object, and then 5 years or 6 years after that, I wrote my latest book that is it's called In the Praetors of the End of the War, or En las praderas del fin del mundo. That is a book that talks a lot about my experience living in the Chihuahuan Desert at the border between the United States and Mexico, and becoming a mother here, and teaching someone the language, understanding a new sense of living in a bilingual, bicultural environment, and all that. So this is more or less a journey that encompasses 3 main books.
Beautiful. I want to talk more about the last thing that you mentioned and your last book in a moment, but I just want to go back to those first few that you talked about, from your first book to after you'd moved to the US. And you said that your writing had changed and it evolved in that time. Can you give me examples of how it changed and how you felt about that change as well?
Okay, well, I can say that maybe one of the ways it changed is that I was first very interested in writing a poetry that came directly from the tradition I was educated in, that is the Hispanic Latin American tradition, where poets mainly write with their ear. Our Colombian poetry is very musical. Our most recognized poet from 19th century, Jose Asuncion Silva, is a poet that is so musical that you could even dance his poems. But just sing them, as people usually say, you can actually dance them. So I was very worried about being attached to a certain musicality, and I was very scared. Well, I wasn't conscious that I was scared, but I was very comfortable, like in a certain diction and in a certain way to express myself in a very lyrical language. When I started working in this project for Chinatown 24/7, that is the name of this object book, and and when I was and when I started writing the poems that now are part of my second book, I was more open to include other people's voices and dialects, and somehow non-poetic fragments of, conversations, um, things that came from non-poetic discourses. I started to experiment uh, and realize that there was a lot of energy coming from understanding language as texture, and and also um, and also um, you know making the poem a place to dialogue with others, like to invite other people's voices into the poem. It didn't sound possible to me when I started writing. I had all these classical ideas about that you have to be original, and you cannot, incorporate what you heard at Walmart in your poem.
Yeah.
Because that's prosaic or whatever. And then I suddenly, when I decided to open up to all that dirty work, just came to my poetry, stayed there. And that believe is the particular example of the way in which I have evolved as a writer.
Yeah. Do you still find comfort in those classical ways of writing that you come from and what you used to read, or do you focus more on expanding and experimenting even more now?
Both. I mean, one of the things I really like about the time we live in is that we don't have to define ourselves anymore. People spend a lot of time in the 20th century fighting about which school they belong to, and writing manifests and poetics against each other, and kind of convincing themselves that there was a kind of discipline that you have to practice, otherwise you will be, failing your party or something. And I kind of I love both things. I can be There is certain type of poetry that I'm not very fond of. I don't I don't try to make poetry that is not very concrete. I love when poetry is concrete. I try to move always away. I always try to move away from abstraction or from very intellectual or you know very what they call difficult poetry, no inviting poetry.
Like
But,
philosophical.
but I'm not against it. I mean, I like that we can experience every time, that everything that is available for us out there, we could go and just take it and take what we want, and it's okay because uh, we are not even forced to write in a certain way. We are not even forced to write to be poets nowadays. The boundaries of this genre are so open that people could do poetry with images, people could do poetry with sounds, they could do poetry with their bodies, and that's okay. So for me, it's just a matter of um, honesty. You are allowed to do what you could do from your own commitment.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the poetry is going to show. If you're really committed, so that's fine. So just, I mean, all this to say that my latest book is very lyrical. It's very traditional. It's because it's written about, it's about the image of the desert that is a very, very old and very it's almost like a classical topic in poetry. And so it was demanding that kind of language. but I can move now to something different, and I don't think that's gonna be um, bring any friction.
Beautiful. I love what you said about just the honesty being the most important part. So whatever you feel you need to speak in order to tell the story is what you use. So I think that's really beautiful, seeing that in your journey and you experimenting and trying different things. Do you feel as though that is widespread amongst the Latin American poetic or literary scene? Do you think that there is a lot of evolution happening? Or do you feel, what are your...
Yes, I think there's a lot of evolution happening, and it had to be with the fact that nowadays we have possibilities as this conversation, for example, this entire festival of getting in touch with other traditions, like, but not, we don't have to wait 20 years for, you know, someone to translate your poems, or for me to get in touch with them. We with them with the publication speed of the blogs and the Twitter and the internet and all that, people get in touch with all the things immediately, and if they feel drawn to that, they're just going to try it, and that's amazing. So that's definitely something that is happening in Latin American poetry in general. In the past, other, like, there were certain national traditions like Argentinian poetry or Uruguayan poetry that were like more avant-garde than Colombia or Mexico, other countries that had a more that they were coming from a strongest 19th century literary tradition. But nowadays, with globalization, those boundaries and the idea of a nation, all those things are in question, and they vary individual by individual, almost, or between one social group and the other. So I see there's a very important and interesting change in the literary production, and it is related to the possibility of communicating with other languages and other traditions, like almost on the daily basis.
Yeah. I'm curious about, because you've mentioned now about globalization and cultures coming together. You mentioned your experience of being in Colombia, particularly in the city that you're from, and then how being a woman and the violence in that space, and how that also impacted your move. All of these things to me sound, political almost. And I guess I'm wondering how you engage with politics in your environment, especially since, you said you like concrete poetry and you try to stay away from things that are, what are your thoughts on that? How does that impact you?
Well, I am very, there are many ways to address your question, and it's a very interesting question, but very large.
Yes, interpret it however you like. Come at any angle.
But one of the things I try to do, and I try to understand when I write and when I read and when I promote the work of other writers, and when I serve as an educator at the university, and those are the things I do every day, is to recognize the work, how important is the work that women are producing nowadays, not just because of the literary qualities that I work every day to understand and underline and promote and all that, but also because of the conditions in which that female writing has been produced during the last 30 years. I have recently edited an anthology of Colombian women writers, and I was and I wrote a critical introduction in which I explain how, for me, reading these women who wrote this poetry in one of the countries, in one of the Latin American countries in which we experience one of the highest levels of violence against women every day. Were writing about their bodies and their life experiences, and somehow recovering in the space of literature those places that were denied to them in the real life, and they were creating the grounds to restitute in a symbolic way that territory that has been taken from women in my country, reclaiming the bodies, saying these bodies are not for you to vilify, are not for you to sell, are not for you to use, are not for you to beat, these are not for you to kill. These bodies are the connection that we have with the world, etc. So for me, that's a very important element of being a writer, of being a woman writer, of being a political subject, of being an educator, all that, no. But I believe that just the fact that the writing is taking place and not the particular topic, the writing address, but just the fact that they are writing, or we are writing from our bodies in different forms, experimental, avant-garde, like, concrete, abstract. Just the fact that we write and we reclaim writing, and we said we have a voice, and this voice is a place in the world. Just that's already the political space. All writing is political in that sense, no? That's how I experience it. In one of the aspects that I can, relate to your question.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. I want to talk about you being an educator now. So you're an assistant professor of creative writing, is that correct, at UTEP?
Yeah, I'm already associate, but it doesn't matter.
Associate, my mistake. What has that experience been like? Because poetry, from what I understand it, but it might be a very different experience from you, it's very much externalizing the internal, it's that way of processing. And then to be in an institution, in academia, working in that space, tell me about your experience there.
Okay. Well, I do work in a program that I'm very fond of, because it's a bilingual master program in creative writing. So first of all, we are located in a space in which we are at the border between two countries, very different countries, United States and Mexico. The border is so artificial somehow, but so real at the same time, that you could go to Juarez, buy cheese in the morning, and be back for lunch with your cheese. Is that close. At the same time, the same crossing could take a life for certain people. This is the dynamic here. There are families who cross every day. There are families who's been separated by the border for several years, stuff like that. So in here, I am like getting in contact with a very particular community who has grown understanding that there is other language there, and that there is other culture there, and that they have to negotiate and keep both together in order to survive.
Mm.
That's the everyday lesson that I have here, and that has nurtured my writing, and that's nurtured the writings of the writing of the students I have here, that we are mostly bicultural writers who are trying to understand their own experience and looking for a path into writing that do not erase parts of their identity, and that help them to negotiate and understand everything that is that has been given to them into that experience. For me, since I started writing, since I was very young, I had one good circumstance, or it was something that happened to me. I'm very grateful that it did happen to me. Since I started writing when I was a teenager, I always was in contact with other writers, and I started participating in poetry festivals when I was very young, but not as a poet invited. Most of the time I was helping other people to organize festivals, and I still do that, and I feel joy, a lot of joy, in promoting other people writing. I believe that's part of the job, that's part of being a writer. Like, there is no way to, because you don't know what is the voice of your generation, and you don't know how is it going to be, how your time is going to be understood, and how what is going to be the music of your time until it is written. But no one can do that alone. I have always experienced writing as a collective experience, always. I don't think you can write alone. I think you will be terribly lost. Even if you write alone, in your house, you're all writing with your books, with the voices, but you have to go out there and fight for the voice of others to be heard. That's why I love poetry festivals. That's why I love conference and meetings, because I think the energy that is created there is very important, because people need to recognize their peers in their generation. So that's why I love the work. I have been commissioned as an advisor to other writers. I probably don't have much to tell them. I cannot teach people how to write. Like, people very, very, very oftenly ask me, oh, but you work in a creative writing program, so you tell people how to write. Do you know how to teach people how to write? And I tell them, well, I don't believe you can teach anyone how to write, but I believe people can learn to write better, on their own. And given the environment in which collective experience will allow them the space to work, they will become better writers in a program like this. We will all become better, hopefully.
Yeah, beautiful. You mentioned there that you don't think that people can write alone, but one of your books is called Writing from Solitude. Is that right? Tell me a little bit about that, what that means to you.
Well, that book is an essay on a Peruvian writer, but it's mostly about the poetry that it's written from the perspective of people who cannot believe in a religious entity, you know, like it's about existentialist poetry, and how I was reading a group of poets like Cesar Vallejo and Blanca Varela, who write from a place in which they recognize themselves as orphans from discourses that give you ground in and give you confidence, like, for example, the existence of God, the existence of a language that communicates, that actually communicates, the existence of the truth. You know, it's like what I try to articulate in that book is that there is a moment in Latin American poetry through the end of the 20th century. It is an arch that begins at the beginning of the 20th century and kind to influence the entire century. That is the discovery that a poet needs to learn to write from a place in which there are not definitive truths about anything, you know. So that's the solitude. The solitude is that you are a kind of an orphan from the idea of language first, because, you know, poets in the 20th century, they realize language is not, you know, you cannot trust it. You always know that whatever you write or whatever you want to write is not going to be ended up represented in the actual poem. And when someone reads, they're probably going to understand something totally different from what you try to write about. And also, the poet needs to learn to write, understanding that he's alone, that there is not, you know, there is not the muse, there is not the transcendence. And what I like about that is that I believe that even though this topic is very, you know, it's very sad, somehow depressive, there is certain humanism that comes with recognizing that we are not, you know, like destined to something, or that there is not like an afterlife, or, as for example, Vallejo experienced his poetry,
yes,
that he recognized in his humanity his transcendence.
Yeah. Wow. What you said there about language and almost not trusting language, I think that kind of leads me to thinking about the languages that we write in, and even how things like translation and just both translation from one person to the next and translation into completely different languages, and how things evolve in translation. You yourself, you've had your work translated into English, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, Macedonian, Arabic, and a few more, I believe, are on that list. What is that experience like for you, letting go of your pieces and allowing them to be translated? That must require a lot of trust.
Well, I have been very lucky of finding people who has been interested in translating my poems, some of my poems, not all of them, into different languages. Most of those translations are related to visits that I have done at a certain point of my career to those countries. So those are probably the result of conversations with people about my poetics and what they were recognizing in there, and probably mirroring, in the sense that if they were interested in those poems, where they found themselves somehow invited to those poems because they recognized themselves on those poems and all that. And I myself translate poetry from English to Spanish. And I believe in the experience of translation in general, I believe that the metaphor of translation is one of the most beautiful, perfect ways to experience real communication with the other, because that the communication in translation is based on the negotiation you do of the gap that exists between yourself and the other, and it's based of on understanding the impossibility of absolutely transport meaning, but it's all based on the intention to recognize the work of the other, the experience, the existence, and the importance of the other, and giving a proof of that encounter. A poem translated is like a trace, it's like a fingerprint, it's, it's a watermark or something. Is what it it's what is left behind a human encounter. A human encounter in during which people try to understand each other and had a conversation recognizing the other one, but always understanding that there is a limit and you cannot totally absorb the other, and that you have, that's why translation is the most precise metaphor of reading, because every reading is a translation in itself. When you read a poem, you always reconstructing the poem, rewriting the poem. But in translation, you understand, like you wanna understand and you wanna transport, but you always experiencing it's not possible to totally transport. The only thing I can do is to leave a trace showing the energy, the intention, the effect, the emotion. So I totally welcome the experience of translation, even though um, it is not always pleasant, because sometimes it is very hard to see how what you were trying to do kind of be, really transport into another language. But then there are other things, probably even in the same poem, that even work better in the language of destiny than in the original. And sometimes you realize something that Jorge Luis Borges used to say. I think he said that as a joke, but sometimes I remember him because he said, like, okay, the translation is really the original, because sometimes when someone translates, they discover something about your poem. You, even when you wrote it, you said like, oh my God, I didn't know this was really working this way, or this was leading this way. This is so interesting. So I always welcome it, because I think it's a ritual, it's a ceremony.
That's so beautiful, and you speak so beautifully. I was just captivated listening to that. That was poetic. You yourself translate between Spanish and English, but you don't translate your own work. Why is that?
Because of that, because I feel like I am not particularly qualified to translate my own work. Not just because, not just because English is not my native language, so I will probably ignore many things and cultural senses and all that, but just because I know people who self-translate, and I'm very interested in their experience, and they sometimes do it for very important reasons, like, for example, because they have a personal relationship with both languages. Sometimes I feel the urge to write in English certain things, because I've been living in this country many years, and because I gave birth to two sons in this country, and and I have come to reevaluate the idea of what is the mother tongue. I thought the mother tongue is the tongue of your mother, but now I kind of believe this also has something to do with the language in which you become a mother and all that. So, but before we get into the psychoanalytic part of, of motherhood language, I, I I I think I would be, losing a lot if I translate my own poems. I just won't be exposed to the experience of return, of, like living, of letting it go and return that represents to let your poems in the hands of others, and that's one of the things we also translation teaches to us, that this concept of authorship as ownership is very old-fashioned, and sometimes it limits the possibilities of our own writing because we are so attached of, oh, I own this, I don't want anyone to touch it, I don't want anyone to damage it. And really, the writer doesn't belong to anyone. The writing is just important if someone else wants to steal it. Otherwise, writing, it's your diary, or it's something like that. So that's why I do not translate, or I do not choose to translate myself.
Yeah. Oh, tell me about the language of motherhood and how being a mother has impacted you and that identity that you spoke about earlier.
Well, it has impacted me a lot. It's been that's been a journey as well. I have experience. I mean, there are two things. The first is the experience itself of being a mother, which is groundbreaking for every woman, I believe. And for a person who writes, it's also very it's brutal, the way in which you kind of split the body, and you soon don't have all that time that you used to have, and you have to learn to think in a different way. Like I think every woman who has kids can understand that the dramatic that difference between having your body for your own and then having to share your body someone else in such extreme way. And it has it's challenging, but it's also always wonderful. But for me, when I had my kids in a different country from the one I was raised on, it was incredibly like shocking to see that I had no any particular tools of how to face this experience of having kids which were exposed to another language, to another identity, who were not mirrors. Somehow I wasn't able to, as I thought I would have done if they were, for example, went to the same school I went, learned the same songs I learned, read the same stories. Of course, I do. I give them a lot of. I try to pass on them a lot of Colombian culture, but the truth is that they are multicultural, and they have no these limitations of what they are. They have not a pre-constructed identity. They just like taking whatever they have over there, and they mix languages in a way that impressed me a lot, because I kind of envy that way in which they play with languages, taking what is available and what they want from whatever language they want to use at the moment, without questioning what does it mean, just like digging and experiencing and enjoying what is available there. So they have been incredible teachers for me, in that sense.
That's really stunning. Well, I want to make sure you've got enough time to share a piece for us. So I'd love it. Yeah, if you could, we're actually only got 10 minutes left. So I'm sure we can extend it if we need to. They're going to cut out this part of me saying this. So yeah, please, I'd love to hear a poem. I understand that you're going to say in its original form and then translate the translation for us.
Yeah. Okay, this is a poem from my first book. It was translated by Olivia Lott. That is, she's from the United States, and she has translated several of my poems, and I will want to thank her for her translation. The name of the poem is Puerto Quebrado, Broken Harbor. I'm going to read it first in Spanish. Puerto Quebrado. Si supieras que afuera de la casa, atado a la orilla del puerto quebrado, hay un río quemante, como las aceras, que cuando toca la tierra es como un desierto al derrumbarse y trae hierba encendida para que ascienda por las paredes, aunque te des a creer que el muro perturbado por las enredaderas es milagro de la humedad y no de la ceniza del agua. Si supieras que el río no es de agua y no trae barcos ni maderos, solo pequeñas algas crecidas en el pecho de hombres dormidos. Si supieras que ese río corre y que es como nosotros, o como todo lo que tarde o temprano tiene que hundirse en la tierra. Tú no sabes, pero yo alguna vez lo he visto. Hace parte de las cosas que cuando se están yendo, parece que se quedan. Broken Harbor. If you only knew, outside the house, tied to the shore of the broken harbor, there is a river blistering like sidewalks. It's like a collapsing desert when it touches earth, taking a long burning glass, so it scales the walls. Even if you are convinced the world troubled by vines is a miracle of calmness and not water's ash. If you only knew, the river's not made of water and brings no boats, no ship, just bits of algae grown on the chests of sleeping men. If you only knew, the river runs and it's like gas, or all that sooner or later must sink into earth. You don't know, but I saw it once, becoming part of things, so when they leave, it seems they stay put. Thank you.
That was really beautiful. I really see the musicality, especially when you were reading it in Spanish. Can I ask why you chose this poem to share?
Well, I don't know. I think that poem is very important to me because it's like the core poem from my first book. It's an old poem, but I like the way in which this poem talks about the classical image of the river as the idea of life. You know, the old image of Heráclito and Jorge Manrique, and the idea that every life is a river. And there is here a tragedy that is being told by someone that is witnessing that there is a river in that place, that it seems that is coming to bring life, but it is really leaving. That everything in that reality that is kind of deserting this person, this speaker in this poem, and the river that is supposed to bring, you know, commerce and boats and all that, it's bringing some kind of bodies that here somehow are supposed to represent the difficult years that we have to endure in my country and all that. So I I just feel that that poem is trying to go to a place that I try to look for in my poetry, in my journey as a poet, that is to leave a testimony of what I have experienced, but from a place that is not didactic or judgmental or even descriptive. It's just a place that try to share the emotion we as human, or in this particular case, the speaker of this poem was feeling in the moment in which this image was created. And I believe that's what every poetry try to do, create images that are able to portray feelings that somehow connect with other people across time and across space. And somehow in this way, poetry will help us to be more attentive to the feelings of other people and better humans.
Wow. And I can see that so much in how nuanced your work is. And even when you speak, your consciousness of the way that you speak and the words that you choose. And I feel like this has been a masterclass for me, just speaking to you and hearing your perspectives. So thank you so much for sharing and for being so open. Do you have anything that you want to add before we finish up?
No, I am very glad to have had the opportunity to share with you. Manal, I was also reading your poetry, and I am very honored, very humbled to share space with a poet like you. And I wish you, many, many wonderful things in your career as a writer. And thank you for participating and, keeping these encounters alive, even in the times of apparent solitude.
Yeah. Thank you. Kembali 20 was made possible with the support of Yayasan Mudra Swari, Saraswati Patron Program and their donors. The Patron Program was created to seek assistance for the survival of both festivals and the foundation. By making a valuable contribution to the Yayasan Patron Program, you'll be directly involved in delivering both festivals in due time. Your contribution will guarantee the future of Indonesia's most meaningful cross-cultural platform of words, ideas, culture, and the creative arts. Follow at Ubud Writers Festival on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, or visit ubudwritersfestival.com for more information about the Patron Program. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.